You're listening to The Manning Report with your host, James David Manning. The news behind the headlines.
We want to try to help give you at least a sense of peace and solace. And so you learn how to protect yourself by understanding what is happening with America today, mainly since the government and Tribulation Trump is in control of all of the attention of most of the people in America and around the world. What is happening? Tribulation Trump, Sunday night, a week and a half ago, on the phone with the Prime Minister, President Erdogan of Turkey, made the decision unilaterally that he was going to pull out the troops that have been stationed there in Syria, along with the Kurdish troops in that buffer between Turkey and Syria, and that having done so would leave at least thousands of ISIS fighters that have been captured without a prison guard, and allowed Turkey the opportunity to begin to make a military move into Kurdistan, into Syria, and upon the Kurds. Now, Turkey, of course, being a NATO nation, we are all part of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And no one could figure out. And now Turkey is bombing in Kurdistan, bombing the Kurds. A number of people, more than 200,000, some say as many as 250,000 of the 2 million people that are Kurds have been displaced. And now Russia is calling the shots as the Kurds are making a deal with Syria in order to have the Syrian forces step back up and take over where the Americans once protected the Kurds. And a large number of people are killed and will continue to be killed. And it's a massive humanitarian crisis, along with ethnic cleansing. A number of people are saying that Turkey wants to do to the Kurds. Now, you may not know very much about that, but historically, the Armenians back in the 1915, several million Armenians were cleansed or ethnic cleansed or were killed during the ending days of the Ottoman Empire. So that a very troubled area. Generally, when we think about the Middle East, we think about Israel and we think about Palestine, both being the same place, or the Gaza Strip, or the West Bank, or the Golan Heights, or we think about areas like Iran or Iraq, former Babylon, when we think about the Middle East, or to some degree Egypt. It has had its days of Muslim or Islamic uprising and confrontation with Israel, basically. But we haven't thought a lot about Armenia. We haven't thought a lot about Turkey, a lot about the waning days of the Ottoman Empire when it stretched as a great empire, not quite as well known as the Roman Empire or the Egyptian Empire or the United Kingdom Empire, but the Ottoman Empire was indeed a major player in Middle East politics and Middle East domination for quite some time. And now Erdogan, who, like Saddam Hussein, Erdogan believes that he is going to be the reincarnation of the great leaders of the Ottoman Empire and reestablish the Ottoman Empire, as Saddam Hussein thought he would be as great as King Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. But the issue here now, a number of people are trying to discover, why did Trump do that? It doesn't make any sense. And one would immediately begin to think about the whole process of wag the dog. That is to say, to bring a diversion of attention of what's happening with the impeachment processes locally and in Washington within the Beltway, to take some of the news attention away from the impeachment process and put it on a war or the formation of a war or people being killed, the Kurds being displaced, ISIS now being released, Russia now taking a major role in Middle East politics with Turkey and with Syria. That wag the dog will be the thing. I mean, it just takes away some attention. But a number of people have the mindset that wag the dog was not the idea. The reason why Trump unilaterally just gets on the phone with Ignorant in the middle of a Sunday evening and pulls out our troops, which a number of people now believe that we are a nation without credibility. Nobody's going to believe if we say we got their back, that we will stand with them. And so we have this happening now, while at the same time the impeachment talks are really getting quite fiery, as Iona Hill was able to testify for 10 hours, and a woman who is fluent in Russian. She is fluent in speaking Russian. She's fluent in Russian politics. She's a graduate of several major schools, including St. Andrews in the UK and Harvard and Yale here in America. And she was able to detail all of the if you will, events that took place before the matter of Trump asking Zelensky to dig up dirt on Joe Biden. And a number of other officials, whether they be ambassadors or State Department workers, are now willingly coming before the Senate the House Intelligence Committee with Adam Schiff, and are giving their testimonies or giving their statements about what is taking place. So there's evidence now out in the open, clearly, that Tribulation Trump will be impeached and most likely removed as well. That there is clear evidence now. They don't need to hold any other hearings, and I think most people are aware of that. Trump himself admitted that he made the call to Zelensky. He's trying to spin it as if something that everybody does, but we know that it was a quid pro quo. We know that it was his personal interest and not in the national interest. And a number of people are beginning to, even Trump supporters are beginning to realize that it is a violation and a threat to our own national security, that Trump has been, since his inauguration, acted only in his self-interest and not in the interest of national security of America. And more people are beginning to realize that Trump is potentially incapable of hiding his malfeasance. He's incapable of hiding his pathological problems. That a number of people who voted for Trump and supported him early on realized that Trump had problems, that he was not really cut out for the job, but they thought that he would grow on the job, that the job as president would change him, that would make him, that would create in him, and would take his talents, and that he would gather people around him that would help form and shape a great world leader. None of that has happened. And the reason why it has not happened is that Trump is completely, he is perhaps in a psychiatrist study, he's probably one of the most unique psychiatric studies of anyone who has had major world influence. There have been other people with the same kind of psychiatric problems that Trump has, but they have not become the most powerful man on planet Earth. Trump is absolutely incapable of changing. He is incapable of seeing the world through any other lens than the one he has always seen it in. He just doesn't understand there's another point of view. Trump is incapable of empathy. He is incapable of putting America and the interest in national security of America before his own business interests. You would say, oh, he can do that. People know how to hide and scam and flim-flam and bamboozle. Trump doesn't even know how to bamboozle. He doesn't. And people are becoming aware of this after 3 years of him now. Psychiatrists, senators, politicians, bankers, people in general are now looking at this man who is wholly and completely inept and unable to even act one way and be another. Trump they said he is who he is. You would think that, let's say, for instance, you said a Coca-Cola and a Dr. Pepper in front of Trump, and you tell Trump that if he chooses the Dr. Pepper, it's going to make a lot of people angry. And if he chooses the Coca-Cola, it's going to make a lot of people good. Now you have to say, Trump, now you have been drinking Dr. Pepper for years and years and years, but you can't put your interest ahead of the interest of the people. The people's interest is wound up in Dr. Pepper. And so what you're going to have to do is, though you may personally like the Coca-Cola, for the good of the people and for the good of, and for your own good, you're going to have to choose Dr. Pepper. Trump is incapable of choosing Dr. Pepper and obfuscating or denying his own sense of worth of who he is. So as time goes on, more people are beginning to realize, even Trump supporters are beginning to realize his pathological problems. Now, a number of people may say, well, that's working good for the people that support him, because he is bringing about a world event that we've discussed before with the decline of white autonomy and white supremacy. And that's the reason for his base. So we have to understand these dynamics. The dynamic number one is Trump is incapable of any sort of humanitarian, empathetic, logical, reasonable human behavior. He's incapable of stepping outside of that. Number two, his base that supports him, that gives him the power to do what he's doing and not be confronted by other politicians, his base doesn't really care about his psychological problems, because they see him at least beginning to establish for them a continuation of white autonomy, a continuation of white supremacy. You'll have to remember that white people, Japheth people, ruled the world for many, many years. I mean, it's amazing as a historical study how white people ruled the world, being a minority. Japheth ruled the world. Japheth colonized most of the Caribbean the islands in the Caribbean. Japheth colonized most of Africa. I mean, you have a small little island over there called United Kingdom. Then you got Ireland up above it to its west. And this small group of people were able to colonize most of the nations in the 750 million people at the time in Africa. They ruled the world. Japheth, the United Kingdom, England, colonized India. The entire mass subcontinent of India was colonized by white people. 150,000 white people, British, English, military, if you will, were able to keep at bay over 1 million Hindus, Muslims, and Buddhists in India until Mahatma Gandhi came along and threw off that oppression. And then, of course, America didn't do a lot of colonizing, but America picked up on taking the colonized nations and making them slaves. So for the most part, even in China, America went into China at the turn of last century, a century ago, and began to set up businesses in China, began to siphon off Chinese business practices, and began to siphon off and to control the Chinese economy until what was known back in 1914, I think it was, if my dates are correct, was the Boxer Revolution, where in Beijing, in Peking at the time, in Shanghai, where the Chinese rose up en masse and threw American businesses out of China. American Coca-Cola, American cigarettes, American meats and foods. They rose up and threw all of American enterprise out of China. It was called the Boxer Revolution, and the Chinese closed the door on all activities with America until Richard Nixon opened the doors in 1974 with China. So you have to look at the second dynamic. First dynamic is Trump is a pathological, incapable person of acting in most ways than a human. He's sick. He's able to function in terms of greed and money and sex, but beyond that, he's sick. Dynamic number two is that white people who used to rule the world. White people, a minority, used to rule the world. They ruled Africa, they ruled India, they ruled the Caribbean. I mean, you go down in the islands now, and everybody down there speaks with a British accent. I mean, I marvel at how British, even though many of the colonized islands of the Caribbean have long since gain their autonomy, they still speak as if they just walked across Trafalgar Square. I mean, you go to Jamaica and you think you're in Trafalgar Square. The impact that white people have had is now gone. And that's what you're going to have to, that is going to have to be discussed. It's going to have to be looked at and talked about by people who want to try to understand what's happening and why Tribulation Trump. It's sort of a marriage made in hell. Trump doesn't really care anything about white autonomy. He doesn't understand it. He doesn't understand most things. He doesn't really care about the concerns of his base, their desire to maintain their autonomy, their desire to maintain their white supremacy. He doesn't really care about that. That's not a concern of his. That's not a passion of his, as did Robert E. Lee. You'll remember when President Grant asked Lee to head up the Union forces, and Lee was living there in what we now know as Arlington Cemetery, but Lee was from Virginia and he was raised in the Southern tradition, but he was a part of the Union military forces, Robert E. Lee was. And Grant asked him to head up the Union forces and at the beginning days of the Confederate Civil War. And Lee told Grant, President Grant, I can't do that. I must denounce my position as a general in the Union forces. I must leave Arlington and go back to my roots. And he headed up the military forces of the Southern Brigade because it was a passion of his. Trump has no such compassion. Trump has no such compassion. I'm sorry, when I say Grant, I mean Abraham Lincoln. Grant was in charge of the forces at the time, but Abraham Lincoln was the president, so really the order came down through President Lincoln. But Trump has no such compassion for white people, Southerners, and those that were trying to protect their white supremacy and their autonomy and their rights, states' rights to own slaves in the South. And that was what that was all about. And now it has risen up in a more broader way. But Trump has no compassion like Robert E. Lee had and was fighting out of a sense of duty, out of a sense of honor, out of a sense of morality. Trump is not supporting the white supremacists, the people who are fighting for their white supremacy and autonomy because he relates to them. Nothing could be further from the truth. So we got these dynamics. And then dynamic number 3, which ought to be dynamic number 1, is that this is all the cogwheels, this is all of the block and pulley, block and tackle, this is all the kinetic energy of what is spoken biblically by Jesus as the tribulation, that these things would happen. And that and it's incapable of them being stopped. The players or the actors or the protagonists will happen to be people like Tribulation Trump, Lindsey Graham, or Hillary Clinton, or Bill Barr, or Giuliani. They are the protagonists in this event, but it's an event that cannot be rewritten. The script for this cannot be written no more than you can rewrite Matthew's Gospel chapter 24 or any other segment of the Bible that can be rewritten. So I think that we need to understand that process if we're going to understand what's happening. And a lot of people are scratching their heads and wondering what is happening with America, And I want to go back again to remind you. I want to remind you that white people, you had 150,000 white people. You had 150,000 white people backed by the United Kingdom, a little small island over there in the North Atlantic, that were able to rule 1 billion Indians, Hindus, Muslims, and Buddhists. 1 billion people under the thumb of 150,000 white. White people ruled the world. And then they colonized Africa. They colonized the Caribbean. And then they came here to America, the Mohawk, the Cheyenne, the Sioux, the Chippewa, the Navajo. They came and destroyed these tribes of people. White people were gods with a small g for several hundred years. And now all of that is history. And there's a small group, 30 to 35 million white people in America, who are trying to hold on to that past history of white autonomy and white supremacy. This is a bit of a news blog we do looking at spiritual wickedness in high places for the most part, making some observations about it and giving people a biblical foundation to the way of interpreting rather than have Sean Hannity or Laura Ingraham or Janine Pirro or Anderson Cooper or Rachel Maddow or Don Lemon, Rush Limbaugh interpret what's going on in the world. You come to me and I'll tell you based on what the Word of God says. They'll just give you their worldly, sinful view. But the Manning Report will tell you what God has said, whether to say yea or nay, whether to go or to stay. You'll be led by the word of Almighty God. Come to the Manning Report on a daily basis to interpret the spiritual wickedness in high places, because there's plenty of it that's going on. And so I am he. I'm the Lord's servant, James David Righteous Rebel Manning, and I'm here to serve you with news and information.